The Panther is the most advanced carrier-based ground attack fighter of its era. Before the day is over, it will help save an American army from annihilation, and in doing so secure the future of American naval aviation itself. At its Bethpage, Long Island facility, Grumman Aircraft was forging its path into the jet age. They were creating a carrier-based plane designed to be the Navy's ground attack aircraft of the future. The first design, the XF9F1, was intended to be a two-seat night fighter, but it was a non-starter plagued by issues with its four-engine configuration. However, when Grumman presented a new single-engine design to the Navy in August 1946, it marked the beginning of a production run that would last for more than a decade. Following Grumman tradition, the XF9F2 rapidly earned the nickname of a big cat, just like its predecessors. But as time went on, it would soon prove that Panther was more than just a company name.
Maybe they wouldn't go quite as high nor quite as fast because they were built a little heavier. But it meant then when you got hit by anti-aircraft fire that they would take more punishment than other airplanes. That's the reputation they had anyway. Now, of course, in modern days now, Grumman has made some of the highest and fastest aircraft that there are in existence.
The Panther was the latest in a line of legendary aircraft that included the Hellcat, the backbone of the American carrier force that defeated Japan. The Hellcat's legacy as a robust ground attack weapon paved the way for subsequent Grumman aircraft, including the
Panther. We lovingly called Grumman aircraft the Grumman Ironworks because their airplanes were so good. They had a few that weren't too great, but generally speaking, most of them you couldn't tear apart.
If there's one word pilots associate with flying a Grumman aircraft, from a carrier to combat and back, it is survivability. In November 1947, the F9F2 rolled out of the Bethpage plant for its maiden flight. The plane's four 20mm nose cannons are easily accessible thanks to pull-out rails built into the nose. The Panther is truly cutting-edge, featuring a pressurized air-conditioned cockpit, an ejection seat, a radio direction finder, and a quick-release bubble canopy. The aircraft showcased superb handling right from the start, which would eventually make it the aircraft of choice for the Navy's Blue Angels flying team.
You could pull 8-10 Gs, and the bird would still be ready to fly the next day. I don't think I ever saw a wrinkle in a Panther jet.
At an altitude of 20,000 feet, the Panther's maximum speed is approximately 530 miles per hour. However, as was the case with many early American jets, finding the power plant to achieve that speed was a major challenge. Following its initial struggles with a four-engine configuration and an inefficient Westinghouse J-30 Grumman, ultimately considered the Nene turbojet from Rolls-Royce, which is located across the Atlantic. This engine is also derived from the Nene. However, the engineers are not British or American. They are Russians who are currently engaged in the construction of the MiG-15, the Soviet Union's most advanced jet fighter of the early 1950s, using imported Nene engines. MiG and Panther will soon reunite in the heavens above a distant Asian peninsula. The jet era presents numerous new challenges, and this is particularly evident in the context of American naval aviation. Instead of the construction of new carriers to accommodate contemporary aircraft, vintage vessels are retrofitted. The heavier weights and faster landing speeds of jets required significantly more robust carrier decks, so those that remained operational were reinforced and fortified. Ironically, as Panthers became operational throughout the fleet by the late 1940s, the biggest threat to the fleet wasn't a foreign enemy, but domestic politics. The Air Force, during Pentagon discussions, was arguing to eliminate large carrier groups altogether. Despite the turmoil of the era, the F9 manufactured by Grumman emerged as the cornerstone of the most advanced seaborne air force the world had ever seen. The Panthers' capabilities would soon be put to the test as global tensions were rising in the Far East. In June 1948, the Soviet Union cut off West Berlin from the rest of the free world. A year of tension ensues, during which an unyielding America refuses to allow the isolated city to be incorporated into the Soviet sphere. The Soviets' initial demonstration of their new long-range bomber, the Tupolev Tu-4 Bull, in the same year, resulted in a shift from tension to dread and paranoia, which then caused anxiety throughout the Western world. The nuclear monopoly of the United States was abolished by September 1949. For the first time, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics can deliver the destructive power of the atom to every significant American city. The nation is sent into a state of disarray as panic reverberates down the American spine. The same year, Mao Zedong's revolutionary forces in China united 1/4 of the global populace under the Red Banner. The nation's anger is directed inward as the external communist menace spirals out of control. The 48th election is a vicious one. Truman is accused of being lenient toward communism. Thomas Dewey, his opponent, exploits these allegations for all the political capital they are worth. The belief in conventional military priorities diminishes or becomes distorted as the apprehension regarding Soviet nuclear power increases. As a result, the Air Force had essentially prevailed in the inter-service conflict by 1949.
And what are we going to do about the communists here in our midst? Some people jeer at the problem, calling it a red herring. Some people get panicky about it. I don't belong to either of those groups. We must neither ignore the communists nor outlaw them. If we ignore them, we give them the cloak of immunity that they want. If we outlaw them, we give them the martyrdom that they want even more. We will, in the government we get next January, we will keep informed and we'll keep the American people informed where they are, who they are, and what they're up to. And if they or anybody else if they break our laws against treason, they'll get a traitor's treatment.
Its B-36 long-range bomber received substantial funding despite its acknowledged vulnerability to interception. Over the vehement objections of Secretary Forrestal and others, congressional leaders began discussing reductions in naval aviation that could reach as high as 60%. The thinking at the time was that the bomber's long-range atomic strike capability made naval carrier task forces redundant. The first casualty of the inter-service rivalry occurred within months. Despondent, exhausted, and having been asked to resign as Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal tragically took his own life on the eve of his vindication. On June 25, 1950, in the forgotten corner of the world that was Korea, Northern dictator Kim Il-sung launched his invasion to reunify the nation by force. he had the quiet blessing of both Moscow and Beijing. South Korea had been excluded from recent statements from Washington that defined the regions the United States considered vital. It was a tragic oversight. The leaders of either Russia or China did not expect the United States to intervene. The assault was swift and brutal. The South Korean army quickly crumbled, and communist troops pushed southward, capturing Seoul within 2 days. However, the United States responded promptly and decisively. With United Nations sanction, United States troops from the occupation forces in Japan were rushed to Korea, some still wearing uniforms stained with coal dust from the Berlin airlift. Most people anticipated an effortless victory over a primitive adversary, but years of peacetime occupation of Japan had left the Americans vulnerable, inadequately trained, and plagued by absurd equipment shortages. Task Force Smith was the first unit to engage in combat. It was a grand name for a single battalion of green troops. They faced an enemy that was highly trained, intensely motivated, and well-equipped. In the face of this onslaught, the beleaguered GI looked to the skies for salvation that wasn't there. Both South Korean and United States personnel were pushed back to the southernmost point of the Korean peninsula. They were barely holding on to their final piece of Korean soil, the Pusan Perimeter. The perimeter shrank daily as North Koreans used Soviet tanks to slice through the dispersed American units. Due to recent defense budget cuts, most soldiers possessed only World War II-era bazookas to defend themselves, which were entirely ineffective. Most of the immediate air support came from F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets dispatched from Japan. However, the long journey to Korean airspace meant that fuel constraints allowed them to stay over the combat zone for only a brief 15 minutes before having to head home. But carriers rushed to the Korean coast. Aboard them, the F9F Panthers were about to have their baptism by fire. Never before had carrier aircraft been deployed into combat like this. In contrast to their Air Force counterparts, the Navy Panthers provided the United Nations soldiers below with sustained cover. Panther pilots flew relentlessly to halt the North Korean tide, flying as many as 4 missions per day, each lasting nearly 2 hours. Carriers that had been inactive for an extended period were reactivated along with the aircraft that would occupy their decks. It was a snapshot of an American military caught between eras, as the majority of these aircraft were older prop-driven planes. Simultaneously, the Navy and Marines launched a nationwide search for pilots to operate them. Numerous veteran pilots from World War II, who had already settled into civilian life, were summoned to return to active duty. Among them was baseball legend Ted Williams, who was one of many abruptly assigned to Panther cockpits with only minimal training.
He really wasn't well trained as a pilot. We trained him to fly weather in Korea in combat. But of course, we were always watching, being very careful. And Ted would have been an exceptionally good pilot had we had longer period to work with him.
The recalled pilots had few jet hours and limited recent flying experience. The haste to integrate older pilots into jet cockpits and subsequently into the daily routine of performing multiple carrier landings frequently pushed the boundaries of safety. Following an expedited carrier qualification on land strips, they transitioned with alarming speed to the real deal.
414, 50 left turn intercept, final bearing 305. Take check.
However, the carrier launch procedure was eventually refined to a high degree of precision. First, the aircraft handlers positioned the Panther on the catapult, the section commander on the port cat, and his wingman on the starboard. Next, the pilot gripped the throttle with his left hand and stiff-armed it to maintain maximum power. Then a final salute to signal that the cat could fire. As was customary, the newly arrived helicopter hovered nearby during the launch operation if the aircraft and pilot hit the water. The Panther's tricycle landing gear meant that it had to kneel in a tail-low position to get the right angle for the catapult. When operating at full throttle for an extended period, the plane had a dangerous propensity to burn the caulking between the timbers of the flight deck. The answer came in the form of retractable blast deflectors, which deflected the hot exhaust and allowed aircraft handlers to pass within 3 feet of them from behind. When launched, Panthers were loaded with nearly 6,400 pounds of ordnance and propellant on top of their 9,300-pound frames. This included over 920 liters of fuel, 760 rounds of 20-millimeter cannon shells, and up to 1,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs. With a range of nearly 1,200 miles, no point on the Korean Peninsula was immune to attack. Additionally, their payloads were delivered with remarkable precision despite their stall speed of 78 knots. The fuselage undercarriage beneath the canopy is visible in this image, where Panthers employ brakes to smooth their descent as they dive onto their target.
We were the heavy haulers out there, and that we're doing a lot of close air work up in front of the 1st Marine Division and in front of the Army divisions also. We did napalm. We used high-velocity aircraft rockets doing early morning road recce's way up where you'd go up in the, way up as we called it, way up in Indian country at that time, way up north, and drop down at first light in the morning and come down along the roads trying to pick up trucks or trains that hadn't gotten in yet. We used the airplane for a lot of purposes out there. We used it on I guess more close air support than anything else. We worked in very, very close in front of our own troops, and that's very exacting work.
To sustain this level of activity, a flotilla of ships that are equipped with extensive supplies follows each carrier. Each of these mobile air bases necessitates replenishment approximately every 3 days. However, Panthers are not limited to flying from carriers located offshore. Marines such as future astronaut John Glenn were assigned to one of the numerous ground facilities that sprang up immediately behind the front lines. Though the conditions were primitive, the Panthers' ease of maintenance made them well suited to the challenge. The runways, hazardous in their own right, were nothing more than grated steel carpeting laid over bulldozed dirt. The continual pounding of aircraft coming in caused the runways to become dangerously pitted. Pilots frequently had to replace their tires after each mission. However, the severity of the land and the defeat on the battlefield were soon replaced by a renewed sense of optimism with the arrival of General Douglas MacArthur. One of MacArthur's initial actions is to initiate a strategic bombing campaign that is intended to destroy every village, town, and metropolis north of the 38th parallel, as he puts it. He issues orders on June 30th that designate all of Korean airspace as a free-fire zone. The Communist capacity to transport personnel and supplies is undermined by B-Day 29s that depart from Okinawa and embark on a 3-year mission. However, American bomber aircrews are instructed to operate in large formations, and there will soon be an insufficient number of targets in the north to justify this type of attack. In August 1950, B-29s conducted the largest carpet bombing operation since Operation Cobra in Normandy. More than 3,200 500-pound bombs were dropped in a 3-by-7-mile area, where a substantial North Korean troop concentration was purportedly encamped. Subsequently, intelligence photographs revealed that there were no enemy personnel present. In one famous instance, a B-29 aircraft pursued a solitary North Korean soldier on a motorcycle down a road until its bombs finally caught up with him. Alexander de Seversky, an air warfare strategist, wrote in 1942 that waging a total war from the air against an underdeveloped nation is nearly impossible. One of the most intriguing characteristics of the most contemporary weapon is its exceptional efficacy against the most contemporary forms of civilization. The Korean experience highlighted this, as formation bombardment would ultimately result in the deaths of over 200,000 North Korean civilians, while having only a limited strategic impact on the battlefield. Despite the enemy road network being effectively devastated, the North Koreans' tenacity in transporting supplies over land or at night allowed them to fight effectively throughout the conflict. On September 15, 1950, at Inchon Harbor, the fortunes of war reversed dramatically. In an audacious maneuver, MacArthur landed an army behind the North Korean flank. When confronted with encirclement, they abandoned their siege on the Pusan Perimeter and retreated. The number of United Nations casualties during the invasion was remarkably low, with only 22 killed. It sets the North Korean army on its heels and is the finest American victory of the conflict. MacArthur's crowning achievement is the United States landings at Inchon. Many in Washington were hesitant to take the risk, as they were haunted by the recollections of the debacle at Anzio. However, the victory is complete, and MacArthur relishes it. As United Nations forces liberate the captured areas around Seoul, they uncover shocking evidence of the brutal character of North Korean occupation. Syngman Rhee, the Korean president, leads the Southerners in a swift re-establishment. However, in actuality, South Korea is autocratic, and Rhee is a dictator, despite being more liberated than the North. Thousands of citizens who are suspected of communist sympathies or who are simply in Rhee's way are marched off to summary imprisonment and execution as Seoul is reoccupied. The northward movement is redolent of Patton's blitz through France. The United Nations forces that are relentlessly advancing on the enemy opposition result in their disintegration. The 38th parallel is abandoned within a month, and Pyongyang, the capital of the adversary, is defeated. The fleeing remnants of Kim's army are obstructed by a substantial airborne delivery. Victory appears imminent, and these paratroopers are encountered by United Nations ground forces. Initially, MacArthur's objective was to eliminate North Korea's military capabilities. However, he gradually developed a more ambitious aspiration. The speed and ease of victory tempted the general, and many in Washington, to contemplate a reunited Korea firmly in the Western sphere. However, as United Nations forces continued to advance northward, among the many prisoners seized were sporadic numbers of what appeared to be Chinese regulars. Surprisingly, the upper command dismissed their presence as insignificant. In response to the abrupt change in circumstances, Truman and MacArthur met at Wake Island to discuss their closing strategy. MacArthur assures Truman that American air power can easily eliminate the bridges and forward Chinese bases that are essential to a successful offensive, even if the Chinese do attack when questioned about the Chinese troops rumored to be massing across the Yalu River. Truman instructs his field commander to refrain from exceeding the limits. Panthers equipped with aerial cameras are instrumental in the collection of intelligence images on both sides of the Yalu. Typically, a fighter escort is present to accompany these unarmed Panthers. They are the Navy's first photo jets, and they conduct numerous missions over hostile territory to evaluate the location and strength of adversary troop concentrations. However, the photographs they return are either disregarded or misinterpreted. The CIA itself estimates that roughly 40,000 Chinese troops were already in Korea by the beginning of November 1950. Incredibly, MacArthur's command pays little attention to evidence that reveals an additional 700,000 troops are gathered just across the frontier. It is, after all, a peasant army that is too deficient in heavy armaments and training to pose any significant threat. November 1st, 1950. 250,000 Chinese troops swarm across the Korean frontier in the early morning hours. The assault's overwhelming mass overwhelms United Nations forces throughout the entire line. For the United States, the Chinese invasion seamlessly integrates into the broader context of the global anti-communist movement. However, the authorities in Beijing do not perceive any ideological confusion. The invasion is predicated on security priorities that predate the emergence of communism by 1,000 years. A substantial Western army stationed on the Manchurian border is simply intolerable to this re-emerging Asian power. Wave after wave of hostile infantry overwhelms resistance. The South Korean representative at the United Nations delivers a prompt and unambiguous condemnation.
I point my finger at these representatives of the Chinese Communist regime, and I ask, why do they come here with unclean hands? I ask again, why does this group come here with the hands that drip with blood, the blood of the United Nations troops, the blood of the Korean people?
Leaders of the 4 largest veterans organizations in the United States petitioned Truman to employ the atomic weapon against North Korea in Washington. Some individuals even advocate for the widespread bombardment of specific Chinese cities. The Joint Chiefs of Staff evaluate both alternatives. In classic Cold War terminology, Truman declares the United States' determination to prevent any additional dominoes from falling.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
In the event of a bombing, officials would determine the extent of the devastation. Utilizing the technical data at their disposal, they would direct civilian defense workers to assist those in danger or those who might have already experienced the full effect of an all-out enemy attack. Hospitals will establish their facilities. The American public is fearful of this, as it is the precursor to World War III. China will undoubtedly receive assistance from the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of a nuclear attack, thousands of individuals in New York participate in civil defense exercises and are instructed on survival and rescue techniques. In the President's terms, it will necessitate that we all prepare to defend our homes. In Korea, terror is more closely associated with reality. Thousands of GIS and Marines stumble south over land that was seized just weeks prior as winter sets in. A greater number of individuals are taken into captivity. MacArthur compiles an inventory of nuclear targets that extends from North Korea to China. He asserts that 26 nuclear warheads will be required for this attack. Antagonism between him and Truman escalates as he perceives himself politically restricted by his inability to strike north of the Yalu, ultimately culminating in his highly publicized termination less than 6 months later. The same issues persist despite the ongoing large-scale strategic bombardment. However, the enemy's movement and supply are only marginally impeded despite the immense destruction brought about. Initially, the enemy's advance is not significantly impeded by numerous attacks on the road network. Rather, they lead to a significant number of casualties among friendly forces and the large number of refugees who are escaping the conflict area. The rationale is straightforward. The Chinese are essentially a peasant army that advances almost exclusively on foot and over land, and they are minimally geared. The majority of their supplies are transported at night or by thousands of porters who trudge through the countryside. This exacerbated the situation. Accustomed to American divisions that consumed 600 tons of supplies per day, intelligence officers significantly exaggerated their transport requirements. Chinese divisions survived on 50. This is where the carriers waiting just offshore came into their own, as they raced along their racetrack courses, circling a few miles of sea carriers launched ground attack aircraft in a continuous cycle of death. The Grumman Panther proved to be one of the most effective weapons of the conflict. For the initial 6 months of the conflict, American air superiority was uncontested. In November 1950, another shockwave shook the West. A new enemy aircraft had arrived, and the Panther was no match for it. And when they began to tear into the B-29 formations that were in operation, America was in dire need of an answer. The first MiG-15 jet fighters that appeared in the skies above Korea exhibited a technological prowess that was previously unimaginable in the communist world. The initial 50 MiGs deployed, which were primarily piloted by Chinese and Soviet pilots operating from political havens behind the Yalu River, rapidly expanded to 450. That figure would nearly double before the conclusion of the conflict. The Air Force F-86 Sabre, the United States response arrives 1 month later. And even though chronic shortages ensure that the number of aircraft in Korea is never greater than 150 at any particular time, the issue of air superiority is never again raised.
After I had finished my Marine missions flying the F-9s, they had one position they kept for one spot in each Air Force squadron that they kept for a Marine pilot, because the Marines had worked out an arrangement. They wanted to get some of our pilots some air-to-air experience. It was great. It was really a different kind of flying that I've been doing in the Panther, down doing close air support and down trying to dig them out down close to the ground. And this, of course, was flying up 35,000, 40,000 feet.
Tiger lead, Tiger 2 here. I got a couple of MiGs out there. One moving around at 2.
You didn't stand off like people do today and shoot a missile and it goes out and does your work for you. What you had to get out. You maneuvered him. You went out, you outflew the guy or outmaneuvered him, and you had to get him behind here 500 to 1,000 feet back and hose him, we'd say, with these 50 caliber. And so it was really old World War II type dogfighting, except you're doing it in jets. And so you're going, you have closing speeds, 500, 600 miles an hour on planes going the opposite direction. You're closing maybe 800 to 1,000 miles an hour. And you'd see planes and you'd get into them, and all at once, bang, there you are, you and the guy you're with. And the rest of the air war has gone someplace. Oh, can't even see anybody else in sight.
In the years ahead, American pilots would demonstrate an unparalleled level of superiority over their adversaries. Despite the Russian planes' exceptional climb rate and turning capability by the conclusion of the war, the United States Air Force claimed a Sabre-to-MiG kill ratio of just over 10 to 1. However, dogfights at 40,000 feet are merely a spectacle in comparison to the conflict that takes place on the ground, where tensions escalate significantly after the sun sets. The Chinese are most likely to launch an attack during these hours, which are between dusk and daylight. The Panther, which was initially designed as a night fighter, is well suited for operations after nightfall.
We used to go up with 2 planes and keep them over the front lines, being controlled with a special type Marine Corps ground radar. And they would give a signal to drop, say, 25, 30,000 feet. Those were enjoyable flights from my point of view because there were very few other people up there in the black of night because they didn't have a very fine control system. So we were all on our own, and of course with an airplane like that you had the ultimate and trust in, it was enjoyable flying that bird at night.
The naval aviators compare the experience of returning from these missions to discovering their carrier on a vast ocean in the darkness of night. They compare it to discovering a postage stamp in a darkened room. Additionally, locating it is only half of the battle. The winters off the Korean peninsula are harsh. Carriers devote a significant amount of their time to circumnavigating the severe cyclones that rage through the Sea of Japan. In this type of weather, flight operations are virtually impossible, and pilots are unable to contemplate ditching at sea. However, the true adversity is experienced by the Marines and soldiers who are engaged in combat on the shore. The Marines frequently refuse to abandon their deceased comrades in the event of extreme losses. The Chinese advance is halted as units that are cut off turn to the air for resupply and stubbornly fight on. Despite the inclement weather, United Nations aircraft conducted continuous strikes against the adversary, thereby allowing for the arrival of reinforcements. Marine and Navy pilots surpassed their aviation force counterparts in close aviation support. The organic support system that has been developed over years of cooperation since the island-hopping campaigns of World War II is advantageous to both the Marine ground personnel and the men in the air. Numerous Army commanders explicitly articulate their preference for Navy or Marine air support over their Air Force counterparts. In the United States, the armed forces are currently in the process of rebuilding, and priorities have been reassessed since the conflict began. In 1952, a new carrier was commissioned, just one of the numerous new Essex-class designs that were introduced. These vessels are the foundation upon which the new Navy will be constructed. And this, the inaugural Essex-class carrier, is a fitting tribute to the individual for whom it is named. Panthers were launched from the deck of the USS Forrestal by 1952. The Navy endeavors to modernize the Panther to achieve parity with the most sophisticated fighters of the era. The Grumman Cougar is introduced. It is essentially the Panther, but with a swept wing that is 40% larger and will be capable of reaching velocities that are nearly 100 miles per hour higher than those of its predecessor. While some Cougars would survive to fly as reconnaissance planes in the Vietnam War, where the carrier-based ground attack jet would fully realize its devastating potential in Korea. The Cougar was introduced too late to participate in the same manner as its elder sibling. By 1953, as the conclusion of the war approached, Panthers had flown roughly 78,000 missions. When the armistice was finally signed in July 1953, the brutal chapter of the Korean War came to a close. The F9F Panther may not have been the fastest jet in the Korean sky. That honor belonged to the Sabre and the MiG. But for the beleaguered soldiers and Marines on the ground, no sound was more welcome than the roar of a Panther's jet engine. It was a rugged, reliable workhorse that delivered precise firepower exactly when and where it was needed most. From the desperate defense of the Pusan Perimeter to the brutal winter retreat from the chosen reservoir, the Panther was the lifeline from the sea. More than just a successful combat aircraft, the Panther was a vindication. It proved beyond any doubt the vital necessity of carrier-based air power in a world of limited regional conflicts. The very institution that had been on the political chopping block just years before had proven itself indispensable. The lessons learned in the skies over Korea, written in the sweat of its pilots and the blood of the battles below, would shape naval aviation for decades to come. The Panther had forged a legacy not of graceful dogfights, but of gritty, unglamorous, and life-saving work. It was the first of the Grumman Ironworks jets, setting a standard for toughness and reliability that its successors like the Cougar and the legendary A-6 Intruder would carry into future conflicts. It arrived when America needed it most. A resilient warrior for a brutal war, and secured its place not just in aviation history, but in the hearts of the men it was built to protect.